I'm going to start really by setting the scene for a study that is in a relatively early point in its development. I'll be setting the scene, and Elaine will be talking in more depth about methodology before outlining some initial observations. So I guess just to open with the question in terms of setting the scene, and that's what are journalists for? Now, a reasonable answer to that, I mean, there's a lot of answers to that, I suppose, but a reasonable one would be that they're for gathering, assessing, presenting information that's needed by citizens to make the best possible decisions about their lives, their communities, their government, their society. But this, of course, raises other questions, like what information is being provided, what's being left out, how is this information presented, and what does this tell us about how and why society and its citizens are defined in a certain way. And again, there are different angles that you can approach those questions from, but the one we're focusing on for this study is specifically how the Irish traveller community is represented in the media. Irish travellers represent about 0.6% of the total population. They're Ireland's largest and oldest racialised group. We can fairly uncontroversially assert that the state has failed repeatedly to address the issues that continue to face this community. And again, that failure is reflected quite starkly, really, when you look at statistics on living conditions, life expectancy, educational attainment, suicide rates, and across a whole range there. So the literature analysing this failure, I suppose, has drawn attention to the contradictory impulses inherent in the state's approach to the Irish traveller population. And there was a good quote there that while the racial state deprives travellers of their chosen ethnic status, which would allow them to name their discrimination racism, it does so on the pretense of caring, based on a Foucauldian biopolitics according to which the role of the state is to manage, and in this case assimilate and settle the traveller population, but ultimately aiming to segregate them. Now, the debate for the reasons for the state's failure is not the precise focus here. Rather, we're attempting to examine the role of the media, and specifically journalistic output, which is news, the role that has in facilitating and representing this discourse about the traveller community. So the recent exchange on the Late Late Show is just one of the examples of the RT's Late Late Show is just one of the examples of what's perceived by many to be a negative bias against travellers in the media. And again, there was this unusually combative interview which saw the actor turned advocate, I suppose, a member of the travelling community, John Connors, repeatedly questioned about his sense of victimhood and defensiveness as he talked about what he argued was the poor treatment of the community in the media. And just again, the exchange, and again, JC being John Connors, so you think that because I come on here that I get a fair crack of the whip, that I get to talk about this, to which the presenter responded, do you not want to be here? Do you not think you sound like a victim? Defensiveness. Well, do you know what? We are the victims. That's the unfortunate thing. Are you a victim? Travellers are the victims. Are you a victim? Of course I am. I'm a victim because I'm not allowed to live the culture that I was born into. I'm not allowed to live the way we wanted to live. So it's a kind of an exchange that neatly encapsulates this debate. One side says that they're the victims of this dominant social structure which excludes and belittles their culture, while the other side denies them this status and argues that they get the same rights as everybody else. Journalists are supposed to be the agents by which this discourse is communicated neutrally and dispassionately to the public. Yet journalism is accused of not only being ineffective in doing this, but in fact perpetuating negative stereotyping of travellers. Now, this study attempts to interrogate this argument to consider How is the traveller community actually represented in news reporting? Are issues relating to the travelling community reported differently? And is there a quantifiable way by which we can actually show this? So we decided to use as a case study the coverage of a single event which affected a number of members of the travelling community specifically, and focus on the language used in that reportage, words, patterns of words, and specific word combinations. And I suppose we focus on language as a means of looking at this from the bottom up. For I suppose specific reasons. One of them being that language isn't a random affair. If people speak or write in an unexpected way or make one linguistic choice over another, more obvious one, then that reveals something about their intentions, whether conscious or not. So again, we decided to focus on the reporting of tragic events or tragedies. For various reasons that I'll come to later. Thus, this study is an analysis of the language used to describe large-scale tragedies in the travelling community, and to contextualise any observations in this regard. We hope to make a comparison with how language is used to report on similar type tragedies primarily affecting the settled community. So the basic research questions, I suppose, that arose are: is there evidence that tragedies which affect different communities are reported on differently? In what ways? And might differences be present in the language used? So our case study that we chose was the Carrickmines fire, which took place last October of last year. We chose this as a relatively, as a very high-profile recent event, and also because we felt it had rich comparative potential. And we used a time frame of exactly 1 month from the fire taking place, October the 10th to November the 10th of last year. And we focus on coverage within the print media specifically, again for different reasons that I'm not going to go into, in part convenience and accessibility, etc. So that's the data set, and Elaine is going to talk to you about how we analysed this data set and outline some of the initial observations, I suppose, that we've come to. Okay.
I mean, I have to get over.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm standing. I'm just so used to standing. No, that's leave the clapping for the end. I don't get any clapping.
Make your mind up too soon. Yeah.
Hello. Well, as Fergal's kind of outlined where these questions come from, and they are open questions. So I'm not a journalist, I'm a linguist. And one of the things that I do is gather data sets together, so gather language data and look at it, not necessarily with an idea for what's there, but kind of operating from the bottom up. So that's kind of where I come at this. So what we have is really observations. We have a tool that we used to mine the data that we collected. We sort of observed the fact that our sampling method was temporal. So we went, which is quite typical of this sort of data set. So if you're collecting examples of media discourse to store and save as a corpus, which is what we did, and a temporal criteria tends to be the same for store, like Corey was saying, choose particular outlets, choose particular searches. So this is very, very crowded, I know, but it gives you an idea of how we started to select the data. Generally speaking, I work with spoken language, and most of the time it's really hard to get that data because you have to record people speaking, and then you have to transcribe it, and then you have to transcribe it at a reasonable level of precision and so on. So it seems like there's loads and loads and loads and loads of language data, and that kind of was our issue. There's so much. How will we select just a bit? So we decided to focus on, as Fergal said, we downloaded lots of articles, and there was a couple of different search terms. Then we decided that we'd focus on news, and then kind of sifting through it again, we found that there were a lot of news features and there were opinion pieces as well. And given that we wanted to get a sense of how the tragedy was reported, we said, let's go for more data rather than less. So let's take news feature and opinion, though of course there's an argument that you should really kind of look at it in a more granular way, and that's a fair argument. But for now, we wanted kind of more rather than less data, let's say. So again, we decided to whittle down and say, okay, so let's focus again. Let's focus on the Republic of Ireland, let's narrow it down again, and we did this based on the bunch of texts that we had. Let's narrow it down again and focus only on daily national newspapers. So that was kind of just a way of controlling what we had. So whatever we started to observe, we could have some sort of idea of perhaps why we're observing it in this way. So there is a caveat. So we're kind of looking at text archives versus corpora here. So as I say, I'm a linguist. We work with databases of language, whether it's spoken or written. We would distinguish a text archive, downloading absolutely everything that we can find on a search term, with a corpus, which has some sort of specific design. And the basic design is what I've kind of just described to you. It's not perfect, and that's a fact. So the thing is, when you're building a corpus, it is of necessity a marriage of perfection and pragmatism and, like Fergal says, and convenience. And it's, sorry, I'm standing in front of things, and it's also kind of iterative. So we've downloaded this amount and we've got this amount, but we may go back again and look for more. So this is kind of the first pass, if you like, and a specific event. So just to give you an idea of what we've got, so we have about 30 articles from the Irish Daily Mail, about 20 from the Examiner, 28 from the Independent, and 45 from the Times. And then we have the Sunday papers as well. So if we count all those words together, what we've got is approximately 85,000 words of news feature, opinion they're in and around this topic. And Fergal combed the text archive to make sure it was on topic. So this is the composition of the corpus, and I think that because even the majority of the data comes from the dailies, we said, well, let's look at that first, because that represents about 75 of the 85,000 words of text. So we started there. So the perspective that you get from looking at language from the bottom up, which is kind of where we came at this question. So we're saying there's something happening here, isn't there? We intuit that tragedies are reported differently depending on who they're happening to. So that's open. We think that might be the case. It seems reasonable to hypothesize that, but let's have a look at it. So that's kind of where we started from. Being able to gather and store and manipulate your view on language data is kind of, for linguists, has definitely changed the way we look at language, changed the way we think about it, and the things that we can say about it. A lot of what we're interested in is how it's used in the media, of course. Why not? It's ever present. And what we're doing is using a corpus linguistic methodology just to kind of start to look at what's happening. I'm going to show you what we did next. We don't have kind of concrete conclusions, as Fergal says, but we can show you the sort of different views that we started to get on this data. And essentially what we've got when we use and look at language in this way for linguists is a new perspective on the familiar. So you start off with your intuitions, you start off with intelligent intuition, and then say, well, this is what I think. And it sort of comes back to, you mentioned an article, Harry, about someone who was looking at the coverage of the killing of young black men, and they were expecting to find racism, but what they also find is this kind of mobilization of a group. So you don't know necessarily what you're going to find when you start with a methodology like this, which is both thrilling and also, it's a bit scary too, because, how do I know what to look for? So there's different ways of manipulating your view of the data in order to kind of guide you in that way. So the first thing we did, once we gathered our database of text, was save them as plain text files. Now they're a corpus, and that's as much as I'm going to say about corpus and corpora. And if you're fascinated by it, then let me know and I'll tell you some more. I can see at least one student who's probably heard as much as she ever wants to hear about corpus linguistics. So we used a piece of computer software called AntConc. It's available from this website. It's freely available. You can download it and start playing with it yourself if this is something that seems interesting to you. There's lots of YouTube videos to tell you how to use each of the different tools. So AntConc looks like this. You save your text, so you've got a Word document with all of your files. You save your text as plain text files, and then you can load them into an interface like this. Okay, so this is all of your data at the side, and what you can see there is our Irish Daily Mail, the Independent, the Examiner, and the Irish Times. That's what we used for this. Then you can start looking at it in particular ways. So one of the most basic things that you can do is make a word list. And what it will do is count for you all of the words that are in your corpus as a whole, and then it will tell you how many times each word occurs, which is fascinating to me, not necessarily to everyone, so there it is. But usually the most frequent word is the. Okay, so I don't know, that doesn't necessarily tell us that much, but you can get different views on the data then. So that's what it looks like. That's a word list. At this point in time, it's probably not telling you a huge amount. Now, for corpus linguists, they'd say, actually, this is like your entry level to data. This is where you start looking at what's there, and this might kind of stimulate some other questions that you might have. So this to me looks like a fairly typical corpus of written language. I'm looking at grammatical operators, I'm looking at them, looking at of, in, to, and so on. So it's not until a little bit further down you start to see words like said, which would be typical, I suppose, of journalistic discourse, and cite, which may have something to do with the search that we entered. So halting cite was one of the search terms, and so on. And what I think is interesting, and I'm going to give you kind of a different view on the corpus. I'll come back to the word list, but it actually has lexical nouns like traveller and cite quite high up on the word list. If this was a much larger corpus of just written texts in general, you'd have to go down really, really far. 4 or 5 minutes. I'll show you a few slides. I'm just going to tell you a couple of things that the software will do for you. It'll tell you how many times each word occurs and how often it occurs. It'll show you if clusters of words appear together, and you just click a tab basically and say clusters. So for this corpus, you can imagine that it was Dunleary Rathdown County Council was one of the more typical clusters. It'll also, if you want to look at a word in particular, if you've decided that the word, I don't know, cite is interesting, you can click on that word and it will show you all of the occurrences of that word, kind of presented in a particular way. And then you can sort it, so you can look for patterns, basically. It'll tell you if there are collocates. And collocates are words that occur together with for more than random reasons. They're words that occur together because they are often used together, they are associated together, and they have a strong statistical tendency to occur together. So we use them to explain things a little bit like, you know, how you know that you say tea is strong but not powerful generally, and a car is powerful but not strong. So strong tea, powerful car, that sort of thing. You can also generate a list of keywords. This is really interesting because what you can do is take a much larger corpus of texts, take your smaller corpus and say, okay, computer, tell me which words in my texts occur with statistically significant frequency. So tell me what's different, in other words, about the group of texts that I'm looking at. So this all sounds a little bit computer says no. I'm going to show you a few kind of outputs from this. So when we start with the word list, and here are all the words that you saw earlier on, I just put them into a word table, you start seeing things coming through. So the actual word list on its own will start to sensitize you to what the text is like. So you see things like cite. I think the words there and they are pretty interesting in terms of an us and them. I'm not saying that that's what's there. I'm saying that it gives me the question. I need to look at that in more detail, see if that's right. So you can start to hypothesize from a word list. So this is what we mean and what Fergal was talking about when he's talking about really sort of bottom up. We're not sure what's there. Let's just have a look, right? So it is interesting that not only do we see the things we expect, it was a tragedy, it was a fire, it happened at Carrickmines, so we're expecting to see Carrickmines, fire, traveller, so on. So we know what we're expecting to see. But as you see there at 47 and 48, where community might be a term referring to the travelling community or the local community, you're starting to see this sort of a separation, and the residents are here as well. So not in the same at the same frequency, but they're there too. So that kind of raises a few questions, let's say. It doesn't answer them, raises them. We can manipulate the data in another way as well. We can say, tell me what the collocates are. So these are collocates for traveller. It's not a particularly big corpus, so you can't say anything definitive, but you can say, look at the story that it starts to tell. So then you see words like visibility, improvements, and then you get these sort of outliers like at 14. You see, it's very, very frequent collocate, and it's Southside. If I knew nothing about these texts, I'd say, oh, that means that it's like an opposition traveller in Southside, but it's not. It's the Southside traveller. So you need to go and look in more depth before you can say anything definitive, obviously. these are a few collocates for residents, and if you just look at the top 2 or 3, you start to get a picture. Maybe not an accurate picture, but this is, starts the process of hypothesizing, so upset and unhappy and so on. Then we said, well, let's look at the word tragedy itself and see what the collocates of tragedy are. And when we saw the word warn, even though it doesn't occur that often, we thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Now we're starting with a small data set. This is going to get larger as we start to add in the other events that Fergal and Steve decided to look at. So you're seeing kind of one here and there. The output is basically telling you it's not that frequent, but it's occurring together fairly frequently enough for us to indicate it. Okay. So then here's a set of concordance lines, and I think I can probably stop on this, Fergal. But what we were interested in is because Fergal said, well, go and have a look at what happens after the word tragedy. I'm interested in that. So we've got a small enough corpus, and you can't really say anything too definitive. But one of the things that came up in the very first line was tragedy but. Right? And actually, I noticed on the keyword list, really, really far down the keyword list, but it was there, the word however. So that kind of indicates maybe a direction that we can go in, even just looking at that word. It's a tragedy but. Now, you see the way you're seeing the data, you might say, well, this is just all of the occurrences of the word tragedy. So you can actually I clicked on the first one, what happened is a tragedy but, and then you can come to the text itself. So it'll show you where it came from. So that's kind of essentially as much as I wanted to do. And Fergal wants me to shut up now anyway.
No, not at all.
This is what you can do with the software.
So as you can see, I'm just going to wrap this up very quickly. I get through all these.
Sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. Sorry, just to say that again, these are I suppose these are observations that are very qualified and based on a very early analysis, as Elaine has pointed out. But certain pointers emerging from the analysis suggest reporting that is characterised less as purely tragedy happens to fellow human beings, to more of this us and them type discourse, and that there's evidence here, or we think, are signifiers of a level of kind of detachment running through this kind of reportage, which can be seen in this tragedy but tragedy however. The human aspect of the tragedy is de-emphasised, with less of an emphasis on the fact that, say, half the people killed in this fire were children, than the fact that residents nearby were affected by the decision to move the survivors, to move halting sites, and also a general lack of biographical details about the victims of the tragedy compared to what we'd usually see in this type of reportage. Again, these are very qualified observations, and our next step would be digging down somewhat deeper into potential word pairings that may reveal more about how language is used in this kind of reporting. And then the step beyond that is obviously applying the same methodology to comparative incidents, and an obvious comparison is the Berkeley tragedy, which took place around a similar timescale. It affected again six people killed, young people, etc., and got a large amount of coverage. And we also, in the last couple of weeks, the Buncrana incident as well. Just to again, one in which sort of children died in this accident, and just looking at how patterns differ within in terms of how those different tragedies are reported on, and beyond that, the next obvious step would be to consider the reasons for this language usage. Is it socialization of journalists, the surrounding culture, or if there are other specific factors that contribute to these tendencies amongst journalists? I think that's where we'll leave it. Okay.